right. If you're here to learn about remedies for arthritis or ways to remove that pesky wart, that's not what this is. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about the importance of log management, which is always interesting right after lunchtime, and building a detection and response capabilities and how to sort of mature that. And a bit of a preamble here. So when I say log management, what I'm referring to here is the collection of all the telemetry, logs, data from endpoints within your organization, centralizing that into a single place, and then being able to query that when you need it. Now for the security information and event management, that's really layering on the analysis component of that platform, and then including alerts, correlations, dashboards, and those sorts of things. So the thing is, the use of a traditional SIEM as a log management platform is a direct conflict of interest. Right? What I mean by that is, as you're scaling out your use cases, as you're scaling out the data sources that you have, the cost becomes exponential, right? So that's why it's important to differentiate between log management and SIEM. So that's challenge one. Challenge two, so most of my day-to-day is mostly incident response work, among other things, and oftentimes I'll talk to organizations about their visibility, right? What does their EDR look like? What log management do they have? What security tools do they have in place today? And that happens from the preparation phase all the way through lessons learned before and after an incident. And so when I speak with organizations, especially small, medium-sized businesses, one of the reactions typically is, hey, I want to deploy a SIEM, I want to deploy a SOAR, security orchestration automated response system in my environment, and almost always that has to be repositioned in such a way that instead of deploying the SIEM, instead of deploying the SOAR, the focus needs to be on log management and building out those use cases first. And then challenge three, ultimately, is back when SIEMs were originally built a couple decades ago, depending on the, SIEM historian that you ask, they were all on-prem. So these were systems that were put on-prem, not necessarily scalable. And as times evolved, as use cases started to be built out, data sources started to be added to these solutions, it became sort of a nuisance because some vendors would re-architect their system, go ahead, use a cloud infrastructure, be cloud first, use cloud services, while other vendors would instead kind of lift and shift their appliance from on-prem into like a EC2 instance in AWS. So that doesn't really scale. Instead, what needs to be the focus here is ensuring that it's a cloud-first product. So given the challenges organizations often face, I'd like to share this detection and response tech maturity model. So when you're building out your SOC, your DFIR teams, your threat hunt teams, it's all about people, processes, technology, right? So people, ultimately the most important component of that. And you'll have your L1, L2, L3 analysts. You'll have engineers, analysts for threat hunting. And like I said, the most important part of those teams. You also have the processes that drive the strategy of why you have those programs to begin with. And then what I want to focus on here is the technical component, right? The tech maturity model, starting at observability. So the idea here is akin to building an application with multiple microservices. So by decoupling each of these technologies, you can then integrate them later on, and this helps to prevent vendor lock. So that's a huge part of this model, preventing vendor lock, as well as being scalable over a long period of time, not running into the same issues that you may have 10 years ago when you've had a traditional SIEM. And as I mentioned, we start here at observability. That's really the foundation. This is log management. This is EDR, getting all that data into one place, but it's also building out that data lake. This is becoming a huge thing. Lots of organizations, lots of vendors are starting to build this out, and this is really reflective of the times with SIEM and how they're being built out today. So I think organizations are starting to take this into their own hands and taking ownership of their own data as they should. Again, this is really the lifeblood of a SOC, ensuring that you have all of that data that you need for those use cases. So I'm going to recall back to 2020, a few years back. How many of you had the chance to respond to the SolarWinds incident? Pretty much the whole room. Okay, I suspected that was the case. So again, work in incident response. The saving grace in many cases were those DNS logs, right? If you recall back to the SolarWinds cases, if you had DNS logs retained in your environment, you could then decode those, understand the CNAMEs, and if that Sunburst DLL that was deployed to those Orion servers was activated or not. So that was very telling very early on with those Python scripts that were developed by a lot of organizations. And so having those DNS logs on hand were critically important for the response actions. Now, of course, you would obviously go about the forensic image analysis and understand the configuration file and the Sunburst DLL itself. So tying all those data points together was critically important. But going back to why logs are so important, I would never recommend to anybody to store DNS logs into SIEM, right? They're just too dense. This is the perfect use case to have a high volume log with very few use cases into a log management platform instead of a SIEM. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. And then when it comes to analytics, I mentioned the SIEM product, right? We're all familiar with that. One thing I do want to call out here is if you have other areas of the InfoSec team, for example, the Insider Threat Program, you may want to layer on a UEBA, User Entity Behavior Analytics platform, which sometimes is integrated with a SIEM, sometimes it's not. But a lot of organizations, again, may want to start with a SIEM and then layer that on at a later date. And then we get to level 3. So this is the enrichment process. So integrating that SIEM that you've then deployed over several months and looping in all these other data points, adding fields to your SIEM so that you can create high-fidelity alerts. If you can create high-fidelity alerts, you can then automate that later on. And what I mean by enrichment is just simple things like integrating your SIEM or UEBA with Active Directory so you can understand users and their roles, their job descriptions, what they do exactly in the organization, and or things to the further extreme, integrating with things like a threat intelligence platform. This is how you gain value in the products that you have in your organization, right? A lot of times what I'll see with these tips, threat intelligence platform or provider, is that they're used ad hoc. Look up IP addresses, look up hashes, look up specific IOCs, look up specific threat actors. And what you can do is add value by integrating via API into the product so that you have an opportunity to respond quicker to incidents. And then last but not least, the reason automation really is at the top of the stack is because once you have those high-fidelity correlated alerts, to reiterate, you get more value out of the product. We always refer back to that, 1 or 2 use cases for SWOR products, which is automated phishing response or automated IP address blocking at the firewall. If you have 2 or 3 use cases, why not just set up a script server and automate those, or use a Lambda in AWS? You may not be ready at that point if you just have 2 or 3 use cases, but if you've gotten to level 4 and walked through these first 3 layers, you then have a multitude of various use cases to then integrate with a SOAR. So at that point, you're sort of ready for that. So one of the positive trends that I'm starting to see is kind of the differentiation, again, between the log management platform and the SIEM, right? You can see here this line right in between. This is vendor integrations, and a lot of these log management solutions that are up and coming over the past couple years are cloud first. But on top of that, they're building apps or they're building bilateral APIs which allow you to query data from your SIEM but store the data itself in the log management solution. Obviously, when you're doing that, you're saving a ton of money. But you're still able to have those SIEM analytics, alerts, dashboards. So case study, I'm going to emphasize the importance of log management one more time, and then I'll stop, I promise. So a couple years back, we got pulled into an incident. It was in AWS with a client, and they had a third-party AWS monitoring company that got compromised, and their keys were exposed in that breach, access keys, secret keys, and the threat actor leveraged those to gain access to an S3 bucket. So they wanted us to understand exactly what happened. So naturally, our first question was, well, what logs do you have in your environment? Are they in your SIEM? Where are they stored? So this organization didn't have them in the SIEM product, mostly because CloudTrail logs, if you've ever tried to put them in a SIEM, they're very voluminous, just like DNS logs are, right? Very expensive. But they had the foresight to centrally manage those logs in their security account. So they didn't have the ability to query. We had to go in, use a AWS glue schema, build that out for them. We could leverage AWS Athena to then query those logs, but they had the foresight, again, to store those logs. And then from there, we were able to pivot on that access key, understand the IAM accounts that were compromised, understand the IP addresses that were associated, go back and forth between the two, and discover that additional accounts were compromised as well. Not only that, we were able to detect the enumeration. It was a user agent string, Scout Suite. It's a very common capability and enumeration tool that threat actors will use. But that was a user agent string that we were able to pivot on as well. So once we had all of those data points, we could pivot to the S3 access logs, look at all the GET requests from that S3 buckets to see exactly what data was stolen. So SIEM wasn't touched at all, but there's a very specific use case that this company understood, which was log management. All right, so let's talk about use cases. So I've spoken to organizations about this several times, and sometimes you'll see organizations who will build these out in sort of a catalog style in knowledge management platforms, and sometimes you'll see organizations just rely heavily on the built-in, out-of-the-box detections within their SIEM. And that's okay. That's a starting point, right? But depending on who you ask, you can either have a top-down approach when you're building out custom use cases or a bottoms-up approach. What I mean by top-down is the strategic initiatives that align with those use cases, bottoms-up being the more tactical approach, which is the more engineering and detection sort of use cases. I think it should be both. I think all stakeholders that are involved with the SIEM, with log management, should be in this discussion, and all of those things should be grouped together in one centralized location. So this is also an opportunity to map these to a framework. Time and time again, we hear about the MITRE ATT&CK framework. That is a fantastic framework to map these to. And you'll also see some of the specific tactical use cases I have listed here. For example, suspicious PowerShell execution. There's sometimes multiple tactics in the MITRE ATT&CK framework mapping to different ways that tactic is done, that TTP is done. This is an example of that, right? If it's a PowerShell encoded command, the response action may be to decode it and then escalate. If it is a download string, you might want to detonate that specific URL or understand what that IOC does with threat intelligence. So this is, to that point, also an opportunity to add another column and know what those response actions are, right? So if this alert triggers in the platform, now I can take this response action, and that also, while coinciding with the automate column, feeds into that SOAR level 4 level. So if you build this out early on, you can kind of work these up and down that maturity model. And the idea here is that, again, you can have this in something like SharePoint, Confluence, whatever it might be. But when you're building out the detections themselves, don't put them in a knowledge management. Build them out as detection as code, right? Use GitHub, use GitLab, build those out, and then you can link them into the use cases, but those should correlate one for one in most cases. And then finally, the one thing I want to talk about here is if you're leveraging both a SIEM and the log management solution to fulfill your use cases, then you can, instead of eliminating use cases when your bill gets too high for the SIEM, you can promote or demote these going up that stack, right? Some of these might get automated at some point, and some of these might get demoted at some point, depending on the threat landscape. TTPs and threat actors change over time, so your use cases and how they're deployed should change over time as well. So here's some of the approaches for building use cases. Going back to that, I keep on mentioning use cases, so how do you actually build these out in your environment? I'll say it again, MITRE ATT&CK framework, great way to map these out. You're not going to get a guaranteed 100% coverage of these. You're also going to have your own internal capabilities, your own detections that are unique and maybe not spot on with MITRE ATT&CK, but this is a great starting point. You can go in, see what threat actors are doing, look at threat intelligence providers and see what TAs are doing, and map those use cases. One of my favorite products is Sigma. This is really the de facto standard and the poster child for detection engineering at this point. If you haven't heard of it and you want to get into detection engineering and building out detections custom to your environment, this is a great thing to look at. I have a link here. Go check it out on GitHub. When you click in there, you can see the high level, I'll say it again, use case. You can click in there. They have YAML files that provide the specific detections. And then furthermore, if you have different SIEM products, they also have a conversion tool. So that YAML file can get converted into the query language so that you can then load that into your SIEM tool as an alert. So really, really cool stuff. Love Sigma, and I think it's going to get really popular here with detection engineering. Additionally, I said this before, but continue to work with internal stakeholders, right? It's not just the CISO and a couple engineers who should be driving log management and should be driving the SIEM product. It can be IT leaders. It can be application and developers who need these error logs, who need these application or user logs, need to understand that, need to respond to troubleshooting issues, those sorts of things. So find those use cases and then double down on those security use cases. That way, again, you can get more value out of the product. And then last but not least, when I'm talking about with log management and deploying that product, I'm not saying don't talk to the SIEM vendors early on. You'll definitely want to understand their primary data sources they'll want to ingest to have the most bang for the buck for the product, right? They'll typically say firewall, Windows event logs, maybe proxy logs. Sysmon's a good example as well. But understand their built-in use cases so that if you need to deploy it and when you need to deploy it, you already have that positioned in your log management platform. And then the big point that I want to make here is as you are promoting all of these detections, make sure that you're testing them, right? Testing them time and time again. Purple teaming, red teaming. There's the atomic red teaming from Red Canary that you can use for unit testing. Ensure that when you're deploying these detections, you're able to detect them and that you're doing that on a continual basis. So huge proponent of testing and also, if you're able to, automating that process. So here's some of the key takeaways. So I'm not going to read every single one here, but what I want to talk about specifically on this slide is log retention. I didn't mention this before, but one of the considerations when you're deploying these types of tools is regulatory concerns. You might have a requirement to retain logs for a certain amount of time. If you're doing open source deployment of your log management solution, you may be able to leverage sort of the built-in tools. I mentioned AWS, built-in services. You can do frequent access, infrequent access, use Glacier, and then set up that retention lifecycle to ensure that it aligns with those requirements internally. And then additionally, because some of these data sources are such high volume, you may want to keep them for incident response use cases for 2 weeks, 30 days, but it might make sense to allow those to fall off over time. One of the other key areas here is centralized versus decentralized. I think depending on who you ask, a lot of organizations kind of have to take a decentralized approach for various reasons, right? I understand that caveat, but I think in a perfect world, which it's not, all of these logs will be centrally located in one area so that you can bring all of that data together when you're doing those correlations. And then the last point here, understand which logs are required to fit. Use cases, I'm going to pound that into the, into the ground with use cases, right? Log with a purpose. Build detections based on those use cases, right? Build with a purpose, and then continually test those detections, test with a purpose. And with that, I'm going to stick around for a little bit. If you have any questions, feel free to say hello, and thank you much.